He invented 3 instruments, and wrote tempo markings in his own blood. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Nikolai Obukhov. Obukhov was born in the west of Russia in 1892, but he grew up in the capital of Moscow, which afforded the young Nikolai the opportunity to continue his nascent musical training at the Moscow Conservatory beginning in 1911. Like many Russian musicians, he spent time at both the Moscow and the St. Petersburg conservatories. Initially, he was a violinist and a pianist, but he soon developed a taste for avant-garde composition, specifically taking after the mysticism of Alexander Scriabin, which seems relatively strange considering the conservatism of most of his primary composition faculty. Scriabin is seen as residing on the very edge of tonality, but Obukhov took this even further, coming up with 12-tone designs independent of Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School further west. Some Obukhov enthusiasts even credit him with the outright invention of atonality, but this is a little short-sighted. What's true is that he is one of the often forgotten names, at the forefront of pioneering new musical paradigms. Obukhov set these principles out much later in his life, in a 1947 treatise titled Theory of Tonal, Atonal, and Total Harmony, which is about as close as we're ever probably going to get to an explication of the harmonic language of him and the other members of the Russian avant-garde of that era. It's his idea of total harmony that he really sets himself apart from the other members of his circle. The idea was that if you write a chord that does not contain all 12 individual notes of the chromatic scale, then you must use in the next chord or the next few chords the remaining notes that you did not use in the previous chord. In essence, it tries to get all 12 tones of the chromatic scale sounded in a series of chords. Not quite Schoenberg's theory, but dang if it isn't close. As a compromise between tonality and atonality, Obukhov would construct symmetrical scales, things that Olivier Messiaen would later call modes of limited transposition. As far as what Russian audiences thought of him at the time, they didn't hate it per se, they just didn't quite know what to make of it. Obukhov belongs in a rarefied group of composers, where you know it's one of their scores just by looking at the score. If you look at an Obukhov piece on the page, you don't even have to go so far as to read the notes. You actually know that it's Obukhov just because it looks so distinct. This included an idiosyncratic method of notation that I'm going to get to in just a second. There was even an all-Obukhov concert held in St. Petersburg in 1916 to show off pieces written in this unique style. We can't say for certain if this would have ever been adopted by other members of the Russian avant-garde because their careers were all very rudely interrupted by political events, but there were composers who were interested in adopting sort of the weird idiosyncrasies of his system, things that were intended to make Western notation a little bit clearer. The system I'm talking about is cleaner looking in that it replaces all accidentals, all sharps and flats and double sharps and double flats, with one single alternative note head. If the pitch is raised, then it becomes an X. The disadvantages of this system, as you might imagine, are as numerous as its advantages, and it never really caught on, although Obukhov's music was not the only one to adopt this in publication. It was seen in a few pieces by Arthur Honegger as well as Olivier Messiaen. The few champions of this system could do little to overcome its numerous disadvantages, and it was last used in a serious publication sometime in the late 1940s. But it was Obukhov's mysticism that extended to all of his pieces, regardless of how the accidentals were notated. He replaced bar lines with crosses, and wrote important bits of text in the music, things like tempo markings, in his own blood, because he was eager to replicate the suffering and death of Jesus Christ in his own artistic action. Another hallmark of Obukhov's work is found in his vocal music, as he was one of the first composers to really want to take the human voice to its limits and use it for its massive range of vocal expression, not just in the realm of singing. This even extended to things that one would consider to be the domain of actors, or of the ancient profession of professional mourners. There is an inherent theatricality to all of his vocal lines. Here are a couple of examples of the kinds of expressions he'd use, taking the voice to its utter extremes. While this mysticism can also be seen in the numerous miniatures he published throughout the course of his career, his real magnum opus was the massive cantata that he called the Book of Life. Like Scriabin's incomplete project Mysterium, this was intended to be a total spectacle. In Obukhov's vision, there were going to be lighting changes and multiple orchestras, and the entire thing would be replete with priests. He worked on the score obsessively, and he saw himself as akin to some kind of prophet, bringing this music to life, not really composing it, but just channeling it. While only the prologue is known to have ever been performed during his lifetime, he still had grand plans for the entire thing, including custom plans for a massive cathedral to be built specifically for 2 performances a year. None of this came to fruition, but we are lucky that we have any of it at all. His wife got so fed up with his obsessive work on this score that she attacked it, either chopping it up with scissors or burning it, only for Obukhov to find out, stop her, and then paste the pages back together using as one of the ingredients, yes, you guessed it, his own blood. You can't actually conduct the piece from this full score because it runs to thousands of pages that are oddly shaped like crosses, or they are fold out to some degree. It's a work of art in and of itself, but it's just not something you can actually realistically conduct from if you ever wanted to do the piece. Some composers, like Nikolai Obukhov, another Scriabin aficionado, were stuck under the artistic repression of the regime to come. But when the revolution hit, Obukhov hightailed it out of there with his family in 1918. He and his family landed in Paris, which was not just a hub of artistic activity, but was also the capital of a country that long had a love affair with all things Russian. The French people could not get enough of Russian exported art, and the Russian aristocracy, while they still had their heads, were all French speakers. There was this weird country bromance going on. I mean, why else do you think Stravinsky's Rite of Spring was performed in Paris? Leaving it all behind had more than its fair share of problems, as Obukhov was then stuck trying to find a way to support his family, his wife and his 2 kids, in a country they didn't know, with a language they didn't speak well probably at all, and after they spent most if not all of their money getting across the continent. He was, however, able to get himself back up on his feet and plug himself into the musical life of Paris, where his contacts included Maurice Ravel, who helped him get publications in France, and he also got interested in what was then the very nascent world of electronic music. This was a space-agey concept before the space age was even a term, but the Russian inventor Leon Theremin had invented an instrument that bore his name, and Obukhov was developing a similar idea that was basically a theremin in all but its shape. He wanted to align the kinds of sounds that this thing made, eerie, otherworldly groaning and wailing sounds, with his own mystical outlook. He wanted it shaped like a cross. The instrument was the croix sonore, and he and a few friends tinkered with the design throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. When it was finished, he made good use of it, and many of his biggest pieces have a part for it. He ended up using it in about 24 different pieces. The instrument ended up being of great financial help in an odd way, as one of its few virtuosi was a countess who made sure that its inventor did not have to live in squalor. Music alone had never provided Obukhov with a career in Paris, and so he'd actually had to go into a career as a bricklayer in order to help support his family. The countess, who went so far as to put a stone version of the instrument on Obukhov's grave, was one of a handful of actual virtuosi on the thing, and they were all female, a fact that did not escape the critics. In fact, the critics related the experience of witnessing a performance on this instrument as some kind of ritualistic action, as these strange motions conjured up wailing noises out of thin air. While the croix sonore has gone the way of the dodo bird, because in this day and age there's really no point in having 2 differently shaped theremins, it was not the only instrument that Obukhov designed. In fact, he designed at least 2 others that we know of. Another of his instruments he called the ether, and it was not intended to actually produce sounds that we could hear. It was intended to produce sounds that were both below and above the range of audible human hearing. The intent was to try to get some kind of subliminal response from the listener. The third instrument was called the crystal, and the idea was that you'd hook up a piano keyboard to a series of glass bowls, creating some kind of weird celeste glockenspiel glass harmonica hybrid. And again, this really would never have fit anywhere because the end result would have probably been too similar to extant instruments, and in any event, the point is kind of moot because of the dawn of electronic synthesis that could get you any of these sounds without having to build a whole contraption. I could not find any records of either an ether or a crystal being built, but they may have at some point. I just don't know, and there doesn't seem to be any information on that. In 1949, Obukhov was mugged so viciously that he never returned to composition again. So distraught was he that the muggers had made off with his best performing copy of the Book of Life. This would have been a version that a conductor could actually conduct from, and this version went to a whopping 800 pages. He died in Paris in June 1954, at the age of 62. Like many members of the Russian avant-garde, he dropped off the map after the revolution, and aside from a few contacts and performances, he never really got back. Further complicating things is his lack of widespread publication. He was able to get a few things out there through his friend Ravel, but it really wasn't enough, and most of his pieces are still in blood-soaked manuscripts in France's National Library. His theoretical ideas never really took off on their own turf, and like Scriabin, he must have been distraught that his envisioned sacred fusion of music and ritual would never be allowed to bring humanity to the next stage of evolution. But as with many neglected composers, his work is being reevaluated and disseminated over the internet, and the literal blood-soaked legacy of this great composer may yet be saved.